Okay, so we are here today with Professor Matt Palmer of Columbia University. We're wondering if you could introduce yourself and also just sort of give a very basic overview of what it is that you do and what it is that you focus on at Columbia.
Okay, so I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Environmental Bio. So I teach a lot of classes, I advise a lot of students, and I do research. That mix of things is what academics do. My research in recent years has taken a decidedly urban bent. And so I've been working for several years on the ecology of green roofs, urban forest restoration, some movement of insects and plants through urban landscapes, and particularly recently on the ecosystem functions from urban vegetation in terms of stormwater management, cooling, and other provisioning services.
Great. Okay, so we read your article on the nature of cities, which was titled Valuing Urban Wildlife, Critical Partners in the Urban System, or Scary, Disgusting Nuisances, which is a great title. And we were wondering if you could just expand a little bit on your views on invasive species and whether or not they really have a role in urban settings or whether we should value more of a pristine nature.
That's a loaded question. There's another essay on the nature of cities. I don't know if you also read that one. There are these roundtable ones that's sort of about this whole values for exotic species. So that's not so much connected. The essay on valuing urban wildlife, to me, comes partly, is really a plea for more understanding of the social dimensions of how people relate to urban wildlife. Because I will tell you that in my circle of students and colleagues, there's an implicit assumption that wildlife can do good things for us and that we want to foster it. And that, I think, is not as widely held among the general public as it is among people who think about wildlife. And it's probably an obvious conclusion, but it's one that I feel like a lot of my colleagues aren't as keyed into, which is to say that we might think, oh yeah, great, let's bring more pollinators in for ecosystem services. And a lot of the world thinks of those as things that might sting you or things to be afraid of. And the idea that the coyotes are coming back into New York, and a lot of people are sort of excited about, hey, this is great wild nature, but then a whole lot of other people see that as scary because they're worried that it's going to attack their dog. And these are not unfounded fears, but there are... Cities are all different kinds of people, and they have different relationships with nature. And so I think that is one of the challenges is since cities are inherently human-dominated places, trying to tease out what is good for a park's management goals or what is a good development in terms of the arrival or disappearance of a certain species is socially a complex question. Which sort of was one of the driving things I was thinking about behind that essay. But to your more specific question about the values of exotic species is another fairly controversial issue because you have a whole lot of people who are I'm not sure if it's appropriate to call it a traditional viewpoint, but a whole lot of resource management has been about control, and you want things to stay the way they were. Or if things are seen to be diminished, you look back to an earlier time as the target. Restoration ecology as a discipline is essentially built around this idea, is that you want to go back in time to some pre-degraded state. And there are lots of great techniques to do that, and there are lots of successes, and there are lots of reasons to do that. But it also leads to a bunch of really complicated questions about what are the appropriate targets for restoration, particularly when you're talking about such highly modified landscapes as cities. Cities are not like, if we could take Manhattan back to 500 or 1,000 years ago, it would mean taking away most of the people, and taking away all of the buildings, and taking away enormous amounts of what makes New York, New York. And no one is going to do that, right? It's not at all feasible to think about putting back what was here before. So you need to think about, all right, well, what can you put back? Can we protect and restore some small fragments of forest in some of the larger parks and get some of that functionality back, get some of that, potential. One of the important functions, I think, of urban nature is its ability to foster relationships, both relationships between people and nature and relationships between people. These are public spaces, these are common spaces, these are places that you can have a shared experience, you can have an experience with something unexpected and outside of human, as direct human control, right? You go to Broadway and you see a play, humans' fingers are all over that, right? You go out and you go bird watching in the Northwoods of Central Park. Yes, there are human influences there, but there's also a whole lot of non-human influence, right? So there's a whole lot of important things that urban nature can do for us as an urban population. But it won't be the same as what was here before. And in many cases, the biota, the plants and the animals and the microbes, have changed a lot. We've lost a lot of things that are probably not going to come back. We've gained a lot of things that weren't here before. And while in some cases it might be a good idea to reduce or even attempt to eliminate some of those, for the vast majority of them, that's just not feasible. If we took away all of the exotic trees, you would have lost a lot of value in some of these places. Now, if you replaced them with other trees, you could get that value back, and perhaps you'd end up with a higher value, especially if there was a difference in the values or the services or the goods provided by one species versus another. But in some cases, it's not like an obvious substitution. So the question about what to do about invasive species partly is a pragmatic question. What can you do? Which battles are worth fighting here? But partly is a philosophical question, which is how many of these things ought to be done. A flashpoint on the wildlife side of it are the swans. Have you talked about the swans? You know anything about swans?
No.
You know what a swan is, though, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So swans are introduced in New York City. They don't belong here. And they're rather aggressive. And some people love the swans because they're beautiful, big, white, graceful birds that are seen swimming across, ponds and in parks. But those swans are introduced wildlife that chase off and sometimes kill domestic waterfowl. And so you have fewer, for example, native ducks when you have swans. And so people who are more focused on restoring native wildlife see the swans as a negative, but that's in direct conflict with a lot of the people who just like to walk their dog around the park and enjoy looking at the swans. And the idea that you would kill a swan is offensive to some people because they like the swans, and there's an animal rights piece of it as well. A lot of the argument, well, the swan is just doing what a swan does. Swans are aggressive birds. It's within its nature. That's part of what it is. You don't kill something for being true to itself, which is projecting a bit on the wildlife, but but people do it, and so there are implicit challenges in that. It's not a wildlife question, but I work mostly on plants, and for a long time, everyone just sort of said, "Oh, exotic species, let's get rid of it," and we're at a point that so many urban ecosystems are so heavily invaded that it's just not practical to get rid of everything. You have to sort of pick your battles. But even I think a lot of times people are picking the battles without necessarily doing a careful analysis of both the likelihood of success and the likelihood of unintended consequences. The damage that goes along, the collateral damage, I guess is the term I'm looking for here, of invasive species management can be substantial. And I don't think there's a very good data on weighing those things. There's an interesting concept, I don't know if you get into it in the class, but have you talked about novel ecosystems?
Yeah, it's actually a huge focus of our course.
Okay, it's a controversial thing.
Yeah.
And the New York Botanic Garden had a nice symposium on it last year. They invited Richard Hobbs, I think is his name. He's an Australian ecologist.
Yeah.
who wrote a book on, and they invited him as a keynote, and they invited a bunch of us local ecologists to give stories about research going on in New York, and there were passionate thoughts on both sides. One of them being, hey, the world has changed. Let's reconcile that we have these new things, and let's manage them in the most. Let's accept this new reality and manage it as best we can to greatest good for the greatest number, but starting from a fresh slate. And then there are people, again, in the more conventional sort of forestry, conservation, wildlife management that are uncomfortable with that because they see this idea of acknowledging that these are novel ecosystems as essentially abandoning the high road of trying to improve it and just accepting, all right, so this is a weed lot, weed lots are the new normal, we don't need to do anything about them. And not that anybody is saying we don't need to do anything about them, but there's this fear that if you recalibrate what belongs to something that somebody considers degraded, then it removes the political will and the economic leverage to try to improve things. Like there's this real concern among several conservation biologists and restoration ecologists and so forth that accepting this idea of a novel ecosystem means accepting a diminished environment without protest.
Do you think that concern is well-founded? Or?
I do, but I don't put myself strongly in that camp because I think I'm frankly much more practical about this. And I don't mean to make it seem like everybody can get along, but I do feel that there are battles to be fought. There are good remnant natural areas in all cities. I think all cities, certainly there are in New York and the other cities I'm familiar with, that ought to be actively managed to preserve their biological integrity and to preserve declining native species and to maintain both the services they provide and, again, the experiences that they provide. So I would not just give up and say, hey, cities wholesale are lost. Let's adopt a new normal for cities and focus our attention elsewhere. But on the flip side, I think the people who are arguing, no, you still need to fight the battles, are not being particularly realistic about the resources available to fight those battles. The vast majority of green areas in New York City, and I'm not talking about the big flagship parks that have nice woods and wetlands and coastal environments. I'm talking about every little patch of green. When you look at a satellite photo of the city, most of those patches of green are in very highly modified environments for which there is no analog. The novel ecosystem concept applies to them. And for the vast majority of invasive species that people are concerned about managing, it's a losing battle. I don't mean to be too down on that, but I think some people are just not recognizing the truth that you can put a lot of effort into removing this species, but you have to keep doing it over and over and over and over again to keep the system uninvaded. And as soon as you stop, and that's either going to stop because your grant funding runs out, or that you switch agencies, or the next person who comes into your job doesn't care about that so much, the system is back, right? Entropy rules. And when you have a landscape that is completely full of the propagules of these things, there is no winning that war. There are battles that are worth being fought to keep it at bay. And military language sometimes gets a little bit overblown in this discipline, but we're not going to eradicate these things. And there are interventions you can take to. One of the big ones in plant ecology in New York City there's a whole suite of vines that prevent forest regeneration, and forests provide much greater range of ecosystem services in these vine-dominated shrublands, really. And the Parks Department has had some success through repeated and extensive management at taking parcels of vineland and turning them into young forests. So it's great. It is a success, but it is a success that's come at a significant cost.